Hello and welcome to our special live coverage of the meeting between leaders of the MIKTA member states taking place on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. Now, this year's event is taking place in South Africa for talks on a key global agenda. And on this occasion, the leaders from 5 middle power countries called MIKTA are now set to hold talks led by South Korea. For more on this, our presidential office correspondent Yoon Jung-min joins us live from Johannesburg. Jung-min, what's the latest?
Unji, so as you said, the MIKTA meeting will take place at any moment here in Johannesburg as world leaders gather in South Africa for the G20 Summit. And MIKTA is a group of 5 middle power countries led by South Korea. Other joining members are Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, and Australia. President Lee Jae-myung will lead the meeting. Their focus is on bolstering multilateralism and promoting international cooperation. I should note that the multilateral meeting takes place at a time of growing global protectionism and uncertainties.
Right, Jung-min, and earlier in the day, President Lee Jae-myung attended the G20 Summit, right? What can you tell us?
You're right, Unji. So the guests received a welcome from host President Cyril Ramaphosa, one by one upon arrival at the summit venue, including President Lee. They shook hands and exchanged greetings. They had met earlier in Canada on the margins of the G7 summit in June. Lee called the South African city beautiful, and Ramaphosa thanked him in response as they took a photo together. This year's G20 covers the theme of solidarity, equality, sustainability, and Session 1 addressed inclusive and sustainable growth, leaving no one behind. The South Korean leader proposed 3 solutions to resolve disparity and inequality, reducing the debt burden for developing countries, building a predictable trading environment, and raising the effectiveness of Korea's development cooperation. First, he suggested resources should be strategically allocated for sectors with the greatest growth potential to reduce the debt burden, adding that Korea prioritizes investment in AI and other emerging technologies. He also vowed to make greater efforts to ensure the success of a WTO meeting set to be held in Africa next year to build a fair trading environment. Finally, he said Korea remains committed to actively participating in ongoing reform efforts by the multilateral development banks. And before the session starts, President Lee met a number of world leaders at the summit venue, including India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Back to you, Yoon-ji.
All right, that was our presidential office correspondent Yoon Jung-min. So we'll have the live footage of the MIKTA meeting in just a moment, but while we wait for that to begin here in the studio today, we're joined by Hans Shuttle, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University. Welcome to the studio.
Hi, Eunji. Nice to be with you this evening.
And I also have Professor Ha Sang-seop, Assistant Professor at the Department of Strategic Region Studies at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security. Welcome.
Nice to meet you.
So Professor Shuttle, I want to start with you. So for the sake of our viewers, could you explain what MIKTA exactly is? These 5 countries, South Korea, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, and Australia, they're pretty geographically dispersed. What do they have in common?
Sure. One important thing they have in common, as Jung-min actually just mentioned in her report, is that these 5 countries are middle powers, which is a growing concept in my field in international relations. And when we talk about middle powers, what we mean are countries that are significant, both in terms of their geopolitical interests and in terms of their economic influence, but countries that are not as large or as dominant as the players that we most often hear about in diplomacy, not as powerful as the US or Germany or Japan or maybe even Britain and France, but growing powers in their own right. And what's really interesting about Korea, Australia, Turkey, Indonesia, and Mexico is that these countries back in, say, like 50 to 70 years ago, they weren't that influential outside their immediate regions. Even in South Korea's case, it became much more influential within East Asia going into the new century. But over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been much more emphasis, say, in Korea, and I think in its MIKTA partner countries, on trying to break out of the immediate regions. And we see a lot of that, say, with South Korea's interest in taking its key export industries and a lot of its key areas for investment like energy and construction and even AI now in technology, and bringing them to parts of the world where historically Korea had not traded, or historically where Korea was not necessarily influential. And I think the MIKTA partners are in similar positions. So this organization founded in 2013, and they not only bring leaders together, but they often bring citizens together as well. There's a summer program, for instance, for college students that happens most years, and just last year it happened here in Seoul. About 28 university students came to Korea and spent some time here, and they were from all the MIKTA countries, and they met the leaders of Korea, and they met a lot of other movers and shakers in the society, and had a chance to interact with their fellow students from other parts of the world. So it's a nice way of thinking about how links develop across countries that otherwise might not be as in close contact with each other.
Right, absolutely. And Professor Ha, why is it so important for South Korea to cooperate with these other four countries? What are some key areas of cooperation?
That's a great question. So for South Korea, that's cooperating with this MIKTA country. It's critically important for some, several strategic reasons. The first, I think, is that this country represents many diverse regions. For example, in case of Mexico from Latin America, and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, in case of the Turkey, and then Australia came from some Oceania, isn't it? That's about, but they share common values with Korea as a middle power, and then they are not global superpowers. The professor, already mentioned about this kind of the powership already, but they each have some regional influence, and then economic weight as well, and then diplomatic independence. The working with them allow Korea to build some flexible coalition of like-minded partners who prioritize this multilateralism and practical cooperation as well. Secondly, we can say MIKTA helped Korea to diversify its foreign policy as well. And then in the era of some global uncertainty, the building a stronger tie with MIKTA countries gave the Korea more diplomatic autonomy, and then reduce some strategic dependency on anyone's blocks.
Professor Ha, I'm afraid I have to interrupt you there for a second. We see President Lee Jae-myung in the venue that's going to be there, where they're going to hold the MIKTA meeting. So we'll go straight over to Johannesburg, where the MIKTA meeting is being held, and we'll come back right afterwards.
Have you seen the photos? Oh, he's throwing a shade. Yeah. What does it say? It says throwing shade as what you have like tape. No, throwing shade. Slap it. Yeah.
So we see President Lee Jae-myung talking at the venue where the MIKTA meeting is going to be held on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. He's now shaking hands with the delegation from Mexico. So Professor Ha, earlier we just talked about how the president of Mexico was not able to attend, and seeing him on the screen right now, the president of Mexico couldn't make it to Johannesburg, right?
Actually, I think it's in the case of Mexico, currently was recently, the leader of some, the president, they did not participate in the big international affair. In the case of some, the ex-president AMNO as well. There are a lot of reasons anyway. Some the domestic, the political issues. It's quite important to decide. The president's going the foreign area to participate this kind of international conference. But I'm not sure, in this year why the President Sheinbaum, he intended to participate, but suddenly in the final decision she gave up some, so that kind of things.
Right, and Professor Shuttle, it's not just the president of Mexico, but Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping, they also decided not to attend this year's summit in South Africa, right?
Yeah, in the absence of the U.S., and again, this is from the G20 summit that's also happening in Johannesburg this weekend. President Trump, unfortunately, has had rather testy, bumpy relations with South Africa all year. When the South African president visited the White House back in May, Trump accused him of running a country that was tolerating white racism, even white genocide. And as you may know, Trump, with Elon Musk, a native South African by his side, has been catering to white South Africans, even bringing some of them into the U.S. as refugees at a time when Trump was shutting down refugee admissions to many other countries. So it seems that the bumpy relations with South Africa kept the U.S. from going. Trump even kicked out the South African ambassador to the U.S. in May and imposed 30% tariffs on South Africa as well. So the South Africans are trying to pull this together without the U.S. being there. On the other hand, with Mexico and China and Russia, also countries where the national leaders are not attending the summit, nevertheless, delegations from those countries are present. So I think we will be seeing and hearing from people from Russia, China, and Mexico. Even the U.S., interestingly, the U.S. is going to host the G20 next year.
Right.
So they are sending a diplomat who's already based in South Africa. I don't think South Africa's thrown the U.S. out in the same way that the U.S. threw South Africa out of Washington. So the U.S. is still there, and the U.S. is sending a delegate to the G20 to claim the chairmanship of the G20 for next year. So I'm not sure where MIKTA is headed next year. Sometimes they meet on the sidelines of the G20.
Right.
We'll see if it happens next year or not. But it does seem on screen that the leaders of the MIKTA countries are informally talking and getting ready to get their summit off the ground. It's afternoon, of course, in Johannesburg. They're fresh on their lunch break, aren't they?
Right. With South Korea as the chair of MIKTA this year, we see President Lee Jae-myung on screen welcoming other leaders from MIKTA member states. And Professor Shuttle, so these 5 countries have been working to build some geopolitical influence as middle powers, as you mentioned. How successful has that effort been so far?
Well, one of my colleagues at Yonsei, Jeffrey Robertson, who has studied these kinds of international organizations and summitry, he wrote a piece a few years ago arguing that it's not as successful as the leaders had initially hoped. On the other hand, it's also not been as unsuccessful or not the failure that some feared, because a lot of times when these smaller organizations get off the ground, they fade away. Nothing happens. They start with a whole bunch of good intentions, and that was certainly the case in 2013. When they started, they pledged cooperation on a whole variety of issues, including economics and development cooperation, cybersecurity, environmental issues as well. And I think a lot of skeptics really wondered if MIKTA would keep going. And that was especially the case during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it was hard to have summits of any kind. But the MIKTA leaders did stay in touch, and they eventually met during the worst years of the pandemic, and they issued some statements regarding the concerns about public health and the need to share resources and so forth during the pandemic. So MIKTA survived COVID. And I think once they survived COVID, they realized they could do a whole lot more together. And here they are again, meeting in Johannesburg.
Right. And we see them taking a group photo now that they've all walked in. So, Professor Ha, what do you think South Korea hopes to gain from today's MIKTA meeting?
Yeah, I think it's South Korea, this year is such a, chair country. That's why now you can see that the screen, the Professor Lee Jae-myung is leading, the MIKTA conference there. We can say this is a good chance for Korea to showcase leadership there. Then can play a constructive role in the shaping kind of some global norm, even without the hard power of the larger state. The second, we can say that build momentum behind the inclusive multilateralism. The Korea see MIKTA as a space where some practical cooperation on issues like some digital transformation, climate action, and then the sustainable development can actually move forward. So overall, I can say today's meeting is less about the grand declaration and more about the building network and the reinforcing trust each other and advancing the shared interest in a very practical ways.
Right. And Professor Shuttle, we just saw them taking a group photo. So they will be holding a summit soon, and the presidential office said they'll be discussing ways to strengthen multilateralism and promote international cooperation. What issues might be on the agenda when they do meet?
Well, I think one issue in particular that they're interested in, it's partly symbolic, is 2025 happens to be the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. And whenever these anniversaries crop up, the member states try to think about ways to reinvigorate the organization or streamline the organization a bit further. And there's been some talk recently about streamlining the UN and trying to render the UN a bit more efficient than it is now. So they might talk about that at MIKTA. And I think the 5 countries, even though at times, as I said earlier, they don't seem to have any one big signature issue that they focus on. They focus on a range of smaller issues, and it often depends on what the leader, the chair of the organization wants to talk about any given time. But this year, they might try to be a little bit more influential at the G20, particularly on trade issues or energy issues, especially since you don't have the US there and you don't have Xi Jinping himself there, even if his delegation is there, or Putin's not there from Russia. So the middle powers, even though it's a bit of a problem for the organizers of the G20, that the US and several other key figures are away, it may be an opportunity this year for the MIKTA countries to try to punch a little bit above their weight, their middle power weight, at the G20 and see what they can accomplish.
Right. We'll have to see how that goes. And Professor Ha, South Korea is serving as the chair of MIKTA this year, right? What responsibilities come with that role?
Yes, that's correct. South Korea is serving as the MIKTA chair for 2025 this year. And then the role carried both, I think, it's the symbolic significance and some very real diplomatic responsibility. Both of them, the responsibility, I think, is quite important. But normally we can say, the setting the agenda or facilitating dialogue and enhancing the group's visibilities is quite important responsibility. And then currently, also some chair country, Korea, during this year, have a lot of some the diplomatic activity. For example, setting the annual priority, and then the hosting the organizing key meetings, and the coordinating member engagement as well. And then today also, the President Lee Jae-myung also, representing MIKTA externally in the global stage, and then driving some practical cooperation as well. So in short, the chairmanship gives South Korea a chance to demonstrate some leadership as a proactive middle power, the sharps on the multinational agenda, and then elevate some in the diplomatic profile, especially at the times when great power competition is undermining the traditional global governance structure.
Right. And Professor Shuttle, we also heard President Yi speak earlier at the G20 Summit, and he talked about revitalization of WTO and about the need for stronger international cooperation to improve the effectiveness of development projects in developing nations. What are your thoughts on this?
Right. This has become a key area of concern, I think, Eunji, for President Lee Jae-myung here in South Korea and for the leaders of many other countries around the world, particularly in East Asia and in Europe, that are traditionally U.S. allies and traditionally trading partners, and also countries that have been very much behind over the years the international architecture for trade that has developed under the World Trade Organization, which founded in its present form in 1995. I mean, there have been international trade systems and frameworks in place ever since World War II. But the Trump administration this year, by unilaterally imposing tariffs on its partners, and basically Trump doing this single-handedly, not even going through the usual channels in the U.S., the legal channels of going through Congress, Trump imposed, all these tariffs on many, many countries. And it's disruptive to the WTO system because in many ways it has the effect of overriding the various trade agreements, free trade agreements that are supposed to hold up across not just two countries working together, but a whole variety of countries. So typically in international trade, you'll have pairs of countries that will make deals with each other, but the WTO was something more than that. It was a whole network of countries that had agreed to reduce trade barriers. And the WTO is really in difficult. It's going to survive, I think. It'll be resilient at the end of the day, but when the country like the US puts in sweeping tariffs, or in any other country were to do the same, that starts to undercut the system of international trade. So I think Lee Jae-myung is actually echoing sentiments that many world leaders have right now, that at the other international organizations, whenever they're meeting, they have to try to do what they can to try to reaffirm support for the WTO. And we'll have to see. Maybe it's interesting. This, I believe, is actually the 30-year anniversary of the WTO as well.
Right.
So it's probably a good time for the WTO to talk about what can be done within its own house to try to offset, to try to help countries take steps to offset some of the inequities of trade over the years. Because even if we may not necessarily like the idea of tariffs as a corrective, the WTO does have issues when it comes to labor standards, to not really sufficiently supporting labor standards in a lot of the world's poorer countries, or not doing enough to offset environmental harm that goes with economic expansion or growth in trade and so forth. So, there's probably room for the WTO as well to reform itself and improve. And maybe that's one thing that we could see a little bit more of at summits, whether it's APEC or the G20 or MIKTA, is to also think about not just reaffirming support for the WTO, but what could be done to streamline it and what could be done then to bring leaders with different perspectives on international trade closer together again.
Right, absolutely. And Professor Ha, President Lee Jae-myung has been emphasizing pragmatic diplomacy, and he said this trip, his trip to Middle East and Africa, would broaden this form of diplomacy to the global south. Do you think we've been able to see that in action so far?
Yes, so far I would say that President Lee's trips has delivered the substantive and the strategic outcomes, particularly in deepening South Korea's ties with its key global South partners. The approach has been notably pragmatic and is interest-driven, aligning well with this administration's broader foreign policy, shift toward this diversification and the middle powers leadership. What stood out most to me is how constantly Korea has applied a tailored diplomatic strategy in each country, rooted in it's a mutual benefit rather than some kind of political ideology. The trips isn't just a symbolic, I think. It is the transactional in the best sense. The focus on building long-term partnership is through the shared interest. Also, by participating in this today's MIKTA conference and then G20 related some engagement in South Africa, the President Lee is positioning the Korea is not just about some regional player, but there's a global connector capable of bridging some divided between the advanced economy and the emerging nations.
Right. And Professor Shadow, we heard in Chungmin's report that this year's G20 theme is solidarity, equity, and sustainability. How is this similar to the APEC leaders meeting that we saw in Gyeongju recently?
Well, the theme of sustainability is one consistency, which is very interesting. Toward a sustainable future, I think. Building a more sustainable future was a key theme for APEC, and now it's turning up here again at the G20. I think what we're seeing are countries like Korea and South Africa. Korea is not really a global South country, so to speak. South Africa certainly is at the heart of what we often call the global South, developing countries that have again become much more prosperous in the last generation, and I think are very concerned about a lot of the dislocating effects that go with economic globalization, and again, just as I was saying a moment ago, trying to offset environmental harms that go with all the increases in trade and energy consumption and production and so forth. So we see the global South countries really trying to elevate sustainability to the agenda. What will be very interesting is to see to what degree the G20 will succeed this time around at coming up with some sort of resolution, let alone a strategy that would be geared more in the direction of green energy or renewable energy sources. At APEC, for instance, despite the theme of sustainability, it ended up taking a very distant back seat in the declaration that was produced. The declaration that came out of APEC at the beginning of this month ended up being much more focused on demands for energy at the present day amid economic expansion and the growth in AI platforms which require a lot of energy. The declaration only singled out at APEC natural gas as opposed to solar or wind or other renewables. So what happens sometimes is the larger countries, at APEC I think it was actually the United States, because President Trump has been emphasizing, unfortunately in my view, a fossil fuel agenda rather than a renewable agenda. So sometimes certain players take sustainability off the focus when the declaration actually comes out. So the G20 will be very interesting to watch. Again, with no US delegation there, will it be easier at the G20 than it was at APEC to move sustainability forward? Then it raises, of course, the follow-up question, can the G20 come up with some sort of actual strategy for a more sustainable future and clean, conservation-oriented future with all the environmental challenges the planet faces?
Right, absolutely. All right, Dr. Shadow, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for coming in today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Eunji.
And also, Dr. Ha, thank you so much for coming in today and for your insights today.
Thank you very much.
Now that ends our news special on the meeting of MIKTA leaders on the sidelines of the G20 summit in South Africa. Thanks for watching.